Hello everyone and welcome to the first work group that I've ever done virtually, and it's our last work group as a TRG. It's a shame that I can't actually see you, but hopefully I will get to speak to some of you on the back of this, and I know that some of us got to finish off our school visits, which we'll hopefully do virtually as well. All of the stuff for today's session will go out in an email, and I'll put it on the G drive as well. First of all, this is the gap task I've started with now. I recognise there's very little maths has probably happened since our last meeting, but I will, at the end of this session, I will talk about the evaluation form that I'd love you to fill in. And if you've got any other stuff that you've done, if you could email that to me, not just on fluency or mathematical thinking, but on anything, I'd be really grateful, because I'm putting in together my professional development accreditation, and it would be really useful for me to see evidence of what's gone well, and likewise if you've got things that haven't gone well. Okay, so based on your feedback from the previous sessions, some of you are asking for specific support for SEND learners, and I know a few of you as well, through discussions with you, were saying that you found it difficult to kind of keep pace with the rapid graspers in your class. How do we do differentiation? So that's the focus of this final work group, with a particular focus on SEND learners. So hopefully one of the themes that has come across in our work groups has been the idea that teaching for mastery is a whole class idea. We're all in this together. And we often worry about the pace being too slow for the rapid graspers in our class. One way of helping is to think about more explicitly about how to support those children who need longer with their maths. If they can be moved along faster, the whole class will benefit. We've already discussed strategies such as same-day catch-up groups, one-to-one teaching, which might be used to target specific groups. But everything I want to share with you today is about whole class strategies. So they're strategies that will benefit every child. So what do we mean by SEND? Well, when thinking about SEND in maths, our first thought might be dyscalculia. All problems in maths, however, can be thought of as being on a spectrum of difficulties. And dyscalculia falls at one end of the spectrum, and you can distinguish this from other maths issues due to the severity of difficulties with number sense. By number sense, we mean supertizing, being able to recognize numbers without counting, symbolic and non-symbolic magnitude comparison, so comparing sizes of things, whether that's abstract or whether that's actual amounts, and ordering. These are difficulties that lots of mathematicians might find, but if you have dyscalculia, you'll be right at the one end of the spectrum with difficulties of that. Dyscalculia can occur singly, but often occurs with other specific learning difficulties. And mathematics anxiety, which we touched on in the previous session, and medical conditions. The British Dyslexia Association is the place to go if you want to find out information about dyscalculia. So much of the content that I want to talk about today is based on this paper, Be Deliberate, Be Explicit, Mark North Explores Decision Making in the Classroom, which is from Primary Mathematics last year. If you want to subscribe to the Primary Mathematics Journal, then go to the Mathematics Association website, and there's lots of really useful articles in there. But let's look at that quote in a bit more detail. If children are too busy trying to organise their learning world, then they simply will not be able to concentrate on the mathematics being taught. So in this case, the learning world is talking about all of the peripheral things going on in class that children are trying to get their heads around. In order to learn effectively, children must be clear about the information that they need to understand and remember, the key learning points that you're trying to get across. And as expert learners, we kind of unconsciously overestimate the ability of novice learners to separate what's really important from what's not so important. And lower retaining or SEND pupils are going to be much more susceptible to this decision-making overload. Cognitive load theory underpins this article, and it's useful therefore to understand before reading it. In particular, this article looks at a new model involving the interplay between working memory and extraneous cognitive load. So let's look at the different types of cognitive load. I think that's useful to understand. Intrinsic cognitive load is how difficult a topic might be, and as teachers we naturally simplify this through a range of techniques, including visual representations and manipulatives, diagrams, stories, or breaking it down into small steps. Germane cognitive load is kind of good cognitive load, if you like. It's the way in which pupils process chunks of information in their schemas. So by a schema we mean, I think of kind of networks of interconnected information around a topic. And the larger and more interconnected that schema is, the more secure the child's knowledge and understanding is. And finally, extraneous cognitive load is an unnecessary distraction. It could be the words spoken by the teacher, it could be unhelpful images on a slide, it could be wall displays, unnecessary tasks which the teacher requires pupils to undertake in a lesson, or even a poorly worded maths problem. So the Mark North article presents executive functioning as a child's capacity to focus attention, remember instructions, plan, organise, complete tasks and juggle multiple tasks successfully. And it's something that children with ADHD, for example, will really struggle with. Whilst it's likely to be more developed in some children than others, it's also one of the last functions to develop and continues developing into adolescence and in fact into adulthood. So that means that teachers should always try and support children to strengthen and develop their executive function skills. The executive functions can be split into three main areas. So we've got working memory, cognitive flexibility and inhibitory control. And I'd invite you just to pause the video and have a read of that. Okay, so hopefully you can see how that ties into cognitive load theory, with its link with working memory and extraneous cognitive load. We need to support children with these executive functions in order for them to be able to focus on the learning, on the mathematics that we want them to think about. Okay, so teaching for mastery is ideally suited to supporting children with SEND. The representation and structure that we use helps all children to access the maths. Mathematical thinking encourages children to process their understanding into their existing schema and make links across different areas of mathematics. Fluency is really important because if we can embed understanding knowledge in our long-term memory, then that doesn't impact on our working memory. We can recall it without losing things from our working memory. Whilst variation encourages schema development and improves access as well. But I actually think one of the most important things is to have a coherent curriculum broken into small steps, because this allows for the learning journey to be explicit and deliberate. So there's four main ways in which we can focus on structure to support children's executive function and allow them to really focus, to kind of put to one side all of the extraneous tasks and decisions that they need to make and focus on the learning. First of all is to deliberately sequence your content and to provide a clear structure. The second thing to do is to think very carefully about how you organise your board that you're showing the children, presenting the learning to them on. Then we have the way that we use the books to support children's working memory. And finally, the learning environment. And using display and resources to support children. So the simplest way of ensuring a coherent sequence of learning where lessons build on prior learning is to use schemes of learning. So the professional development materials are an example that we've looked at. Maths No Problem is an example that the more I use, the more I like. I've been using this to homeschool my year 1 child, and he's just really flown with it. Really kind of every step is very, very manageable for him, and it builds coherently on top of each other. And finally, the White Rose, which we use in school. All of these have been put together by a team of experts who have thought really carefully about the structure of the curriculum as a whole. But we haven't spoken so much about how our individual lessons can be structured to support children with their executive function. Pause the video and have a little look at this example of how mastery lessons can be structured. Hopefully that all makes sense to you. I really like this. I particularly like the initial task idea. Providing children with a hook. A couple of ways that it's sometimes more successful than others, but I've particularly found it useful where you've been teaching a concept that you know the children have got a method, but it's not the most efficient method. And so you can let them struggle at the beginning of the lesson with this other method and then say, stop, hang on, how about if I told you a way that you could do this in half the amount of time? And all of a sudden their ears prick up and they're like, yeah, okay, we want to find a way of doing this more easily. And another way is to use intelligent practice to actually draw some of the children to think about, well, what is the purpose of this lesson right at the beginning? Obviously, practice is key. The idea of this bit at the end to reflect on what they've learned, that's going to be really useful for SEND pupils who perhaps have had to make multiple decisions during the class, actually use your other students to pick out, right, what do you need to remember? What were the key learning points from this lesson? The Mathematics Mastery 6-part lesson plan is worth considering. I don't think that there is a right way of structuring your lesson. I think that I think that the only thing that's a right way is that you've thought about it carefully and there's reasons for you making decisions to structure your lesson like that. So I wouldn't advocate starting every single lesson with a hook, because you'll be coming up with hooks just for the sake of it. Sometimes you might want to show an abstract concept before you show before you represent it using a pictorial or a concrete way. But you should know why you're choosing to do it in that way. And what I like about this is this idea of a talk task, because it encourages us to think, well, sometimes the children don't have to just be thinking on their own. They can be having a discussion about quite an open-ended problem that can kind of take their learning forward. And this idea of developing learning, so you've introduced here in the new learning the concept in its simplest form. Develop learning, you're going to look at it from a different angle. That's where you're introducing things like variation theory, sort of non-examples, alternative ways of coming at the problem. And they also have a plenary here, which was where you'd kind of pull out those key learning points if you hadn't already done that through the lesson. Okay, So our bookwork structure. So I looked through my books this year, and many of them are pages of calculations with no clear evidence of structured learning happening. So for a child to go back over a month later, a week later, is pretty useless. It's just a place to do the work. And what we want to do is provide children with the key learning messages. So you can use the maths books to support this. So I looked through and there were bits of examples from my books where I have been doing this. So this is an example here, teaching fractions, where I gave the children a couple of procedures for simplifying fractions, and the children then reworded that in their own book. And also we've got the fraction wall here. So this is a page that can be used as a reference point. In the second example, the initial task used intelligent practice to allow pupils to draw out the key learning point from the class, which was if you multiply one factor by a power of 10 and divide the other by the same power of 10, the product stays the same. Okay, and then there was other key learning messages that came out as well in that lesson. That was one that the child had spotted, and I made sure through my teaching that we drew all of the rules around multiplying powers of 10. Another thing that's probably worth mentioning at this point as well is that STEM sentences can be used to highlight that kind of key information in the lesson. And it's also important to have a high expectation of pupils in terms of using whole sentence answers, so you can hear them expressing those mathematical ideas. And this, I'm sorry about the quality of this photo, it's the only one I could find. It's not something we currently do at school, but something that I'm quite interested in looking into is a double page spread. So that really helps children kind of see the structure of the lesson, and because each lesson's over 2 pages, they're able to kind of easily navigate through their books, and then you'll have things like knowledge organisers and other information on the single pages in between. This is a set of stickers that I will send to you from Melissa Molnar, who is the Teaching for Mastery specialist who works at Wood Hill Primary School, part of the Inspire partnership. And they kind of encourage deep reflective thinking about mathematical processes, leading to the key learning messages being highlighted. So yeah, look out for that on the email. So flip chart pages can be used to sequence and support the structure of the learning, providing children with an effective overview of key learning messages over time. Working walls can be used to reduce the reliance on working memory, and other strategies that reduce working memory requirements include having large year group specific number lines, pasting times tables, grids to each desk so that the children don't have to kind of use their working memory for their times table knowledge, and making manipulative and representations easily accessible. You might have seen these kind of lessons sequenced in this way. It can be useful for children to referring back to previous lessons. And then on board work structure, I will share with you this free course for teachers, which is by Oliver Caviglioli, if I said that right, who is an expert on dual coding, and he is the guy that does all of these kind of icons and things that you see everywhere at the moment. I found this course really useful for how to lay out my board, how to communicate on worksheets, displays. It goes into all of that, and it links it into working memory and cognitive load. So I think it's really fitting at this part. The course itself is actually designed with the concept of retrieval practice in mind as well, so it kind of asks you questions and then you can go back to it at a later time, and it will you can choose to just do the questions that you got wrong the first time to kind of help you remember it in the for the long term as well. On the board work as well, you've got the PD materials. So this is a series of slides that I've just copied from the PD materials, and you can see how the way it's designed leads nice and clearly for children counting in twos, but a bit of variation in the way that it's represented here, and that work's all done for you. It's quite nicely done. So that's it. I hope that you found that useful. Please do complete the Google form survey to give feedback on this session, and I've done a tiny little section at the end where I've asked for whole year's teacher research group feedback, and that's for me to use in my professional development accreditation. It does not have to be all positive, you know, things that in some ways those kind of constructive criticism that you guys have given me has been far more useful than the positive stuff that you've given me as well, although I am very grateful for that, obviously. So it just leaves me to say thanks for your contributions and your support. I hope that I'll continue working with you next year, and I may well speak to a few of you before the end of the term for your school visit meetings.